Well, welcome back, students. I hope you guys had a good break and are ready to jump back in to do some learning. We are still in 28.2, and I call this one 28.2.2 because the Vietnam War should be explored in a greater depth than what our book actually looks at. So I try to cover some additional information that will hopefully give you some context and understanding of the Vietnam War itself. So today we're going to talk about more directly of some of the events that happened in the war, how America fought the war, and how it was different from what we've done before. So let's jump into it. Now, if you remember last where we left off at, JFK had just been assassinated, and Lyndon Baines Johnson, who we typically refer to as LBJ, had taken the oath of office and taken over for Kennedy. In fact, he did so aboard Air Force One. That is a famous picture there in the middle with Jackie Kennedy standing next to LBJ as he takes the oath of office. Now, when we talk about Vietnam, it is fought poorly. And there's no easy way for me just to say, or any wiggle room for me to say that, because in all reality, the Vietnam War is one of the most ill-planned, ill-executed wars in American history, if not almost the history of the world. It was just from the get-go, it was not properly executed. So let's talk about LBJ really quickly, though. When he was looking at the policies that were driving a lot of United States foreign diplomacy, he was still a believer in the containment and domino principles, where he was saying, well, if we let Vietnam fall, it's very likely we're going to lose all of Southeast Asia. And that's what one of the things he was fearing about was his legacy, ultimately, as being the guy that let Southeast Asia fall completely and absolutely to communism. So he was willing to still try to engage in the war like Kennedy had, but he didn't really want to put large numbers of American troops on the ground. Instead, he was still working off the doctrine of let's let the South fight it. We'll bring in advisors. We'll use some military equipment from the United States. But for the most part, this is the South Koreans' war. That's where he starts off at. He really thinks that he can limit and contain this war, and that if they provide just enough resources, that they would be able to stop the communist threat from coming in. One of the things, though, that he shifts from is that for the longest time, the CIA, especially when French occupation was occurring, the CIA played a heavy role in operating in Southeast Asia, and especially in Vietnam when it comes to training, using military aircraft that the CIA had then taken themselves and designated as one of their assets. Johnson looked to end that, and so he kind of pushed the CIA out and allowed the American military to come in and take over a vast majority of most of the operations. Now, at the same time, he doesn't want to have a massive buildup, but at the same time, he understands he's going to need troops on the ground in order to help fight and wage this war. So there are a number of tens of thousands of American troops that are in Vietnam during this time frame. Also, one of the things that he changes too is that he appoints General William Westmoreland to oversee the war in Vietnam. However, Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, he did not really set up his own independent cabinet. Instead, he inherited a lot of JFK's cabinet, and he didn't replace him very quickly. And one of the people he kept on board was Robert McNamara. Now, McNamara, one thing to really understand about him is that he comes from private industry, and he's part of like this WizKids group where he's very, very focused on numbers, and he believes that he can fight a war strictly based upon numbers. And this is a failed strategy from the get-go. McNamara thought that he could fight a limited war, and if he could inflict X number of casualties, that it would lead eventually to North Vietnam pulling out of the South, and the South and North being separate, or he thought that it could lead to a victory along the top if he just inflicted enough casualties. The reason why this is a failed idea and a failed strategy is that throughout the entire time fighting the French, the Ho Chi Minh and his generals didn't really care about casualty numbers. In fact, In many battles where they were fighting the French, they were losing 5 to 10 times the amount of troops, which means for every one French soldier that was killed, you'd lose up to 10 Vietnamese soldiers. And the North continued to absorb that level of damage without having their military structure fall apart. Admittedly, at some point you run out of men, but the North continued to find a fresh supply that they were able to continue to push out. And they took mass casualties, yet they continued to push forward in the war. So that's why McNamara's number strategy was an absolute failure, why it didn't work whatsoever. It was flawed completely because it's completely outside the realm of normal military tactics and how you actually fight a war. Basically, when you talked about war, Tecumseh Sherman, he basically showed how to always fight and win a war, which is take every means necessary, slash and burn, destroy anything in your path. The only way to gain victory is by complete and total annihilation. And this was not the strategy that LBJ took when it came in regards to the Vietnam War. Instead, he wanted to fight a limited, protracted campaign without committing too much to it and hoping that they could win the war using restrictive measures of war in hopes that the North would return back up to where it was from. Completely flawed, though. Terrible ideas. McNamara should have been fired. In fact, McNamara later on in life apologized for his actions in the Vietnam War and absolutely took ownership of the deaths of tens of thousands of Americans because of his failed and flawed strategy. Anyways, let's move forward. McNamara, again, he was a major roadblock in the war. He set up these ridiculous rules of engagement that created death to American troops, especially to American airmen. And so throughout the war, the United States suffers immense casualties just due to McNamara's problems. He limits the number of targets that Americans can hit. He forced airplanes to fly at a certain altitude so that it would be quote unquote kind of fair for the North, that they'd be able to engage Americans pilots. If you look at and you study the Vietnam War, you will find that these rules of engagement were literally insane. They were not allowed to bomb airfields, so the North had protected assets for their airfields so they could send up fighter pilots to engage the Americans, and the Americans weren't able to stop anything coming out of those airfields. The Americans were not allowed to bomb SAM sites, surface-to-air missile sites. They weren't able to bomb anti-aircraft guns. They weren't able to hit military-specific targets like oil fields. They were not allowed to actually engage in what you need to bomb in order to win a war. At some points, they were talking about that in order to follow the rules of engagement, often a pilot would have a 5-page manual that they would need for certain areas in the country in order to know what they could and couldn't shoot at. And so because of these policies that were in place, the United States lost over 10,000 airplanes over Vietnam because of these insane, ludicrous rules of engagement. The United States military should have been able to absolutely and utterly destroy the North's ability to wage war. And they were completely handicapped. McNamara and Johnson every day would look at what they were going to allow and not allow a pilot to destroy. And then they would send those orders out. So even if you were operating on one set of rules of engagement the day before, the next day you may have been told that you couldn't bomb X, Y, and Z when you were able to bomb X, Y, and Z the day before. These changed all the time, so it confused pilots. It put them in harm's way, and again, Americans died because of these policies. And so the same thing happens on the ground. It's not just in the air. The United States military was not able to use its its overpowering military advantages. Often tanks were not allowed to operate in the front lines. They were not allowed to do a direct invasion of North Vietnam. Some of that came from the fear that China would have gotten involved. However, when we look at it from a historical standpoint At this point, the Soviet Union and China were having some disputes among each other, and so China was less likely to actually engage, aside from supplying military aid, was more than likely not willing to send men like they did in Korea. So a lot of the United States fears, or McNamara's fears more than anything else, really drove the nail into the coffin of the American efforts, because he just wouldn't engage in a war that America could win, because America could win the war legitimately. We had the abilities and the means and the equipment and the power to absolutely and utterly devastate North Vietnam, and we never use it. So that's one of the biggest problems from the get-go, is Robert McNamara and Lyndon Baines Johnson are both handicapping the American military from being able to fight this war and win. And because of this, we lose over 50,000 Americans that die in Vietnam because of their inability to effectively fight this war. All right, so how do we really get engaged into the war? Which draws us directly into the war? Well, we were, again, sending advisors. We were kind of sort of already fighting the war, but in order to really get in there, Johnson needed an excuse. And this happens in the Gulf of Tonkin. And in the Gulf of Tonkin, there's two destroyers that are out patrolling in the area, and one of them comes under attack by a torpedo boat, or at least that's what it's assumed, and they are able to scare it off, and it disappears. The next day, there's two American ships in the region, and this is where a lot of disputes really come about what happened in the Gulf of Tonkin. Now, again, the ships claim that there was torpedoes in the water and that torpedo boats were attacking them. Reports actually have come out with naval aviators that say they didn't see anything, and some people reporting that it's quite a possibility that the two ships were fighting or shooting at each other because there was a haze that day. All in all, when it comes down to it, and you look at the history and the background of the Gulf of Tonkin incident, there was no immediate threat, nor was there a direct attack on American vessels in the Gulf of Tonkin. Yet, Johnson used this inflated report where they left out very key critical details and said to Congress, look, we're under attack. And so he went over to Congress and he said, look, we are being attacked by the North in Vietnam. I need to have authorization to go and fight them with everything that I can. And this comes to what's known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. It is probably the closest thing that you can get to a declaration of war without it being a declaration of war from Congress. When it states, what it stated in there is it allowed Johnson to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and prevent any further aggression. Basically, it said, you can go fight a war. And basically, that's what Johnson was allowed to do, and why he was able to massively increase bombing campaigns and be able to bring hundreds of thousands of American troops into Vietnam. And this is where you really start to see the numbers swell, but also in order to meet that need, this is when you see the draft reopen up again, and American men are drafted in to go and fight in the war. This creates a lot of societal conflicts because the draft, when it was implemented during this war, they allowed all sorts of exemptions, like if you were married and had children, if you were working, if you were in school, and other things. So typically, it was seen that if you were in one of these protected categories, that the unprotected, the poor, and middle to lower class people were often taken up and forced into the war, while those of positions of privilege, sometimes they would be referred to, were protected from having to go over to Vietnam and facing the fear of dying over there, basically, is what it is. Sorry. Now, remember, Johnson, he wasn't elected. He's sworn in after Kennedy's assassination, so he very quickly found himself in a re-election campaign that he had to go up against. And who he ended up facing is a Republican known as Barry Goldwater. And so during this 1964 election, Goldwater really comes out very heavy-handed. He's known as what's known as a war hawk. And he states that he is so opposed to communism that he's willing to do pretty much anything he can to end communism. And this was up to and including using nuclear weapons. So he was looking to, if the war wouldn't close out quickly in North Vietnam, that he was potentially willing to launch nuclear weapons into North Vietnam to end the war quickly. And since some of his positions were so extreme, I mean, he even talked about nuking Cuba at one point. So some of his positions to go after and fight communism was seen as highly extreme, and there was a fear that he would commit too many American lives to these endeavors, and also quite possibly force the Soviet Union into a nuclear war. So many of the people were looking at Goldwater thinking, well, what's the lesser here of what's going to happen? And that's where Johnson was really smart about this. Johnson really wanted to focus on domestic policies. He had a very FDR-esque way about him of where he wanted to create social reform programs in order to try to better the poor Americans' positions and also African American positions within the economy. And so he took a very domestic approach to when he was talking to the American people during this campaign. Also, another thing, though, that he did is that he really looked at North Vietnam and he said, look, I'm not going to commit large numbers of American servicemen to go over to Vietnam to die. I'm going to keep those boys home. We're going to wage this war in a limited capacity. We're going to win it, but we're not going to risk all those young men's lives in order to do so. And so people really listened to Johnson, and in all reality, when he won one of the largest lopsided victories in the history of American politics. Over 60% of the popular vote went his way. As you can see, Goldwater, he only carried small sections of the South and Arizona from where he was from. And so it looked like, Johnson was well on his way to domestic policy reforms. However, within 4 months of being in office, he committed hundreds of thousands of American troops to go into Vietnam to continue to fight this war. So for all of his talks of, we're going to focus on just simply domestic measures and hope that Vietnam kind of clears up on its own, really fell apart quickly for him. What really starts to push greater U.S. involvement is in 1965, they attacked a military base at, I'll probably murder the name here, but Pye Cu. And Pye Cu is one of the largest American air bases in Vietnam, and it was right at the tail edge of what's known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Remember, we talked about that in our other units. And so it actually found itself under constant attack throughout the war, suffering from mortar attacks, which would hit airplanes sitting on the flight lines. And because of this, Johnson, he starts up what's known as Operation Rolling Thunder, and he starts to slightly bomb north with B-52 bombers. Again, remember, I just talked about this early on where McNamara would pick the targets, and often they were not critically significant targets. In fact, sometimes he restricted B-52 missions and sent in fighter bombers, where it would take up to 6 to 8 fighter bombers to do the same damage that a B-52 would do. And instead of just being able to bomb and destroy North Vietnam in an effective manner, they constantly held Americans back. If you want to know how disproportionate the use of force was when it came to actually hitting military targets, understand this, that the United States dropped twice as many bombs on North Vietnam than we did in the entire Second World War on Germany. So if you're thinking to yourself, why didn't the United States just annihilate the North? We had the means and the capabilities, and we dropped enough bombs to do so, but we just did not strike military targets and command and control functions that would have allowed for us to do it. And this is McNamara again, and LBJ handicapping the American military from performing and winning a war. By the end of 1965, we now have over 184,000 men in arms in North Vietnam fighting this war. But again, they're handicapped. They're forced to have ridiculous rules of engagement where they can't push forward, they can't get out of where they need to be at, and they can't inflict the major damages that they wanted to. America was never able to bring its superiority of numbers in order to destroy the North. They were not allowed to take tanks out. Typically, tanks could have imposed massive casualties on the North if they had been able to be used out effectively in the battlefields, but instead they were pulled back or often only operated in small numbers instead of using a large tank battalion to wipe something out. And that also comes from the fact that it's a pretty heavy jungle out there, so it would be hard to operate tanks anyways through that kind of dense jungle area. Um, One of the things though that we started to do is you've seen this creates an evolution in how America fights wars that even happens today. And this is the growth of what's known as the air cavalry, where we would load up men onto helicopters, we would leap over the top of enemy lines, drop troops in, attack the back end of the enemy, and then once we have broken and defeated their lines, we would then hop back in the helicopters and move back to a safe location. This is how the air cavalry was constantly utilized. However, these missions often were quick drop ins, drop back out, come back out again, drop back in, instead of just utterly and completely surrounding the enemy and annihilating him. Again, force of American numbers are never truly brought to bear in order to completely smash the Norse ability. The thing is that they're also fighting kind of two enemies. They're fighting the Norse army, the PAVN, and also they were fighting communists that were living in the South that were part of a communist insurgency. So they were fighting what are known as irregular troops, people that would basically dress just like a civilian, and then they would engage and fight with you before you knew that they were a combat individual. And this often led to problems with Americans engaging with civilians and killing civilians because of the similarity of dresses. That's why it is illegal, according to the Geneva Conventions, or you're considered a non-combatant, and if you're engaged in combat operations, that you're not afforded protections under the Geneva Convention. It's to prevent this type of activity. It's to protect civilians in all reality. When Clark Clifford, who became the new Secretary of Defense, looked at McNamara, he found that there was what he called no military plan to end the war. McNamara was fighting it piecemeal whenever he could, but he was not firmly committed to victory. By the time that 1969 hits, we were over 500,000 people, which should have been adequate numbers at that point to be able to destroy the insurgency. But again, LBJ and McNamara had just screwed the war up completely and prevented America from winning it in any way, shape, or form. All right, so what are some of the problems with American tactics? Well, we look a little bit more. We decide we're going to try to clear out some of the jungle foliage and coverage. We use what's known as Agent Orange to try to kill some of this off. However, Agent Orange is highly toxic chemical. It was accidentally dropped on American troops. It was dropped directly onto Vietnamese citizens and also troops. It created numerous health problems, birth deformities and defects in babies. So you had a lot of problems with the use of Agent Orange and its lingering effects on Vietnam because of this. Also, remember I talked about individuals wearing the same clothing that most people in the South would wear. This led to Americans going to do search and destroy missions where they would literally go into villages and destroy everything in its path, thinking that there might be communist insurgents, which led to the death of women and children too. Free fire missions, basically you show up in an area, you kill anything that moves. That again is another problem with irregular troops engaging in combat, is then the other side takes up positions such as a free fire attack that can kill numerous people during that time frame. What this creates is news sources that are embedded with American troops and also operating in Vietnam often would show pictures of dead women and children, showing how poorly the war was being fought and executed. And this was one of the reasons why it creates animosity between the American people and American troops that fight over there. And when they try to come home, they are given terms such as baby killer and murder of civilians. Comes from these issues with the tactics. And so this was broadcast on TV everywhere. It's known as the Living Room War, as because Americans watched what was happening in Vietnam every night. All right, let's talk about one thing that also changes the face of the war, and this is called the Tet Offensive. And it happens on January 31st, 1968. And what it is a huge, massive coordinated attack by the Viet Cong across South Vietnam. They attack everything from American military installations, South Korean government locations, Vietnamese military installations, government facilities, American airfields. It's just a massive, full-scale assault. Now, the Tet Offensive is often said as this giant fantastic military operation that crushes the Americans. Many times you'll hear it referred to that as, but instead it is actually one of the worst defeats in military history when you look at it from the perspective of it being a military operation. In many cases, 50-1 were the casualty numbers. 50 Vietnamese were killed compared to every one American. There was a area that was controlled by the North right after the Tet Offensive, and in a 3-week engagement between American Marines and the North, they had over 10,000 men that were ejected from the fort with suffering massive casualties at the loss of about 125 American Marines. All in all, in the end, ultimately the Tet Offensive was everything pretty much taken during Tet was reclaimed by the United States and South Vietnam very quickly. Again, the North suffered huge casualty numbers, just massive casualty numbers. But a lot of the pictures that come out of Tet really turn America against the war, and also it was again reported by the American media as kind of a victory by the North against the American troops, and some of them start calling it the American occupation. And pictures that come out of there with dead American servicemen, and then one of the most famous one. Sorry guys, I've had to try to reduce the number of images that I show you because some of them are a bit graphic out of Vietnam. But there's a famous one of a South Vietnamese general shooting a man point blank in the head wearing civilian clothes after the Tet Offensive. What has often failed to be reported and shown in context with that picture is that the individual in civilian clothes was actually known by the person who was shooting him as a colonel in the North's army. And operating in civilian clothes, it means you're operating in a spy capacity, which allows execution on the battlefield. And that's why he was shot. But the image itself is a powerful image that was used to show that the war was failing and that cruel tactics were being used. And another thing that it shows is that the war is far from being over. And this really starts to push from people wanting to pull out. Walter Cronkite, he labels the war as completely unwinnable. If you don't know who Walter Cronkite is, one of the most famous news reporters in American history, LBJ, states after Walter Cronkite says this, "If I've lost Walter Cronkite, I've lost the country." All right, lastly, let's quickly talk about opposition to the war. Opposition starts off, again, we talked about the draft, where it felt like young men were being sent off to die and upper middle class individuals and family men were not going to be. Also, the media didn't back the war in any way, shape, or form. The government failed to show means and reasons why we're fighting there. College campuses start to riot. You start to having issues like at Kent State where troops open fire on protesters and people die. You see mass protests and rallies throughout the country. And also, LBJ started to face pressure from Robert Kennedy and Eugene McCarthy, not the same McCarthy that you're thinking about, for the Democratic nomination for president. Kennedy came out very anti-war, that he wanted to end the war itself. Ultimately, the pressure was so much for LBJ that he decides not to run again and to open the pathway for Robert Kennedy to try to become the next president of the United States. The other thing is that he decides to try to stop a lot of the bombing campaigns in the North to try to gain further support. Overall, Vietnam, in and of itself, when you look at it, what it does to LBJ probably would be better regarded in American history because of his social policies if he had been also successful in Vietnam. But instead, Vietnam absolutely and completely ruined his presidency. All right, guys, sorry this one's really long, but I feel it is important to cover Vietnam clearly and correctly. I have a very personal vested interest in Vietnam. I had an uncle who died over in Vietnam, and so his name was David Lajeunesse. He's on the Vietnam Memorial, and occasionally you'll probably see me at school where I wear a memorial bracelet to my uncle who died over there. That's why this war is a bit personal for me, and one of the reasons why I joined the military actually was in honor of my uncle. All right, guys, so we will continue on with this unit tomorrow, but hopefully you guys got a lot out of this. Make sure you take care of that quiz and the bell ringer, and we'll see you next time.